The German soldiers thought their fortresses were unbreakable. They had built them with steel and concrete, buried deep into the earth like tombs that could never be disturbed. The forests of Europe were filled with the sound of their hammering and drilling, echoing as they dug miles of tunnels, storage rooms, and bunkers. These were not just walls and ceilings. They were monuments to arrogance, built to withstand every shell, every bomb, every piece of artillery the Allies had thrown before. And for a while, they seemed indestructible. The defenders laughed at the smaller American guns, shrugged off air raids, and mocked the Allied soldiers who tried to storm their fortifications. But one cold morning, as the fog lifted from the valleys of France, something thundered across the earth that even they could not laugh at. The ground shook as though the world itself was tearing apart. That was the moment the 240mm howitzers of the United States Army announced themselves, and every man who heard that roar, friend or foe, knew something had changed forever. It wasn't just another weapon. It was a beast of war, a gun so large that it seemed like a piece of the earth had been ripped up and forged into iron. The barrels were long and menacing, the wheels massive, and the shells, each weighing over 350 pounds, looked like miniature torpedoes. When one of those shells left the barrel, it did not simply fly. It screamed. It carried with it not just explosive force, but the weight of America's determination. To the German soldiers cowering in their tunnels, the first impacts felt like earthquakes. Concrete ceilings cracked. Dust poured down from the walls. Lights went out. And for the first time, the so-called invincible fortresses began to tremble. But to understand the terror those guns created, you must also understand the men who operated them. They were not faceless soldiers behind a machine. They were farm boys, mechanics, steelworkers, and teachers from towns scattered across America. Many had never left their counties before the war, and now they stood on European soil pulling the lanyards of weapons that shook mountains. Some of them had fathers who remembered the thunder of cannons in the First World War. Others had uncles who told stories of the trenches, of young men broken by machine guns and gas. Those memories lingered, and now it was this generation's turn to face their trial. But unlike their fathers, these men had weapons that could tilt the balance of power. And as they loaded the massive shells into the breach, they whispered quiet prayers, not just for victory, but for survival, for an end to this madness, and for a world their children might grow up in without fear. The first time the 240mm was fired in anger against the German fortresses, even the American soldiers were stunned. The ground bucked under their boots as if struck by an invisible hammer. The air vibrated in their chests. Some men instinctively ducked, even though the blast was behind them. And then, seconds later, they saw the distant hillside erupt. A great plume of smoke and dust shot into the air. Pieces of stone and concrete flew like toys tossed aside by an angry child. When the smoke cleared, they saw the impossible. A section of the fortress, which had seemed so permanent, had been ripped open like a cracked egg. Cheers rose among the gun crews, but mixed with that triumph was silence, too. A heavy, sobering silence. For they knew that inside that fortress, men had been buried, crushed, or worse. War had no clean victories. The Germans had long believed in their fortress system. The Siegfried Line, the bunkers near Metz, the heavily fortified positions across France and Belgium. They were supposed to hold back the tide. They had been designed by engineers who calculated angles, thickness, and endurance. These were supposed to be the safe havens where German soldiers could laugh at Allied attempts to destroy them. But no engineer had prepared for the 240mm. No blueprint had calculated what would happen when American industry poured all its skill into a weapon that was less like a gun and more like a force of nature. Inside those bunkers, men felt the earth jump under them again and again, until their confidence dissolved into raw fear. The sound of incoming shells, low, growing, then bursting into thunder, was the sound of inevitability. A few brave commanders shouted at their men to stand fast, but deep inside, even they wondered if they were standing inside their own tombs. Meanwhile, the Americans operating the guns carried their own burdens. The massive howitzers required entire teams to operate. It could take hours just to position one, dragging it across muddy fields, setting the base plates, and aligning the barrel. Sweat soaked their uniforms even in the cold. Muscles ached from lifting shells so heavy that they could break a man's back if dropped. And always, there was the pressure. To fire quickly, to support the infantry advancing, to silence the fortress guns that were cutting down their comrades. These men knew that every round fired could mean dozens of American lives saved. That gave them strength, but it also weighed on their hearts. The civilians who lived in the nearby villages never forgot those days. They had spent years under the shadow of German occupation, forced to feed soldiers, forced to live under curfews, forced to hear the boots of men who did not belong in their homes. When the Americans rolled in with their colossal guns, the villagers gathered at a distance, watching with awe. They had seen artillery before, but never anything like this. Children clung to their mothers as the ground trembled. Old men, who remembered the cannons of 1918, shook their heads in disbelief. For them, the thunder of the 240mm howitzers was not just a sound of destruction, it was a sound of liberation. Every shell that shattered a fortress wall was another step toward freedom, another blow against the occupiers who had stolen years of their lives. For the villagers, the guns were not monsters, they were angels of vengeance. One of the soldiers, a young gunner named Thomas from Ohio, wrote in his letters home that the hardest part was not the exhaustion, not the deafening blasts, not even the danger of counterfire. The hardest part, he said, was the waiting. When we're ordered to fire, he wrote, it's almost a relief, because the tension is unbearable. We know the Germans are in there, and we know our boys are waiting for us to knock holes in those walls so they can get through. We feel the responsibility on our shoulders. And sometimes, when the fortress finally breaks, I don't feel joy. The Germans, for all their training, were human too. Soldiers who had boasted of their impenetrable bunkers now huddled in darkness, clutching their helmets, praying for silence. Some wept. Some shouted at the walls as though anger could hold them together. And some simply went numb, staring blankly as each impact shook dust from the ceiling. A few surrendered when the bombardments paused, stumbling out of ruined entrances with their hands raised, faces gray with soot. The American infantrymen who saw them realized something profound. The mightiest fortresses, the proudest defenders, could be broken not just by steel and fire, but by fear. And that was the lesson the 240mm howitzers taught more than anything else. Fear is the greatest weapon of all. Yet, for all the destruction, there were also moments of grace. In one village near Metz, after a fortress had finally been reduced, American soldiers found a group of German prisoners sharing their rations with local children. The same men who had fired at Americans hours before now handed bread to starving kids. War reveals the worst of humanity, but sometimes, in fleeting moments, it also reveals the best. The Americans watched in silence, realizing that these men, too, were far from home, dragged into a war they had not chosen. That night, as the howitzers were repositioned for the next target, some of the gun crews sat quietly, reflecting on what they had seen. They were reminded that the real enemy was not just the man in the opposing uniform. It was the madness of war itself. The legacy of the 240mm howitzers went beyond their size and power. They became a symbol of America's ability to rise to any challenge. Factories that once made cars and tractors had turned to producing weapons that shook continents. Workers who had never held a rifle contributed by forging steel, machining parts, and assembling the guns that would end tyranny. The howitzers were not just the triumph of soldiers. They were the triumph of a nation united in purpose. And when the war finally ended, when the fortresses lay silent and the world began to rebuild, the men who had fired those guns carried with them memories that would last their entire lives. Years later, veterans would sit on porches or gather at reunions, telling stories to their grandchildren. They spoke not just of victories, but of the fear, the exhaustion, the moments of doubt. They told of how they had faced fortresses that seemed eternal, and how they had watched them crumble under the weight of determination. And always, there was a lesson beneath their words. No fortress, no matter how strong, can withstand the will of free people determined to break it. No wall of stone can resist forever the hammering of justice. And no empire built on oppression can endure when faced with the courage of those who fight for liberty. For the Germans who survived, the memory of those howitzers remained a scar. They admitted, years later, that nothing terrified them more. Not the planes overhead, not the tanks in the fields, but the relentless pounding of the 240mm guns. They could not see them, only feel them, hear them, and watch their world collapse under their fury. For them, those weapons were not just artillery, they were the sound of defeat echoing across the land. And so, when history looks back, it does not see only the destruction left in craters and ruins. It sees the larger truth, that sometimes, in the darkest of times, it takes overwhelming force to break through arrogance and cruelty. That the price of freedom is high, but the alternative is far worse. And that the men who pulled those lanyards, sweating in the mud, deafened by the roar, burdened by the knowledge of what they unleashed, carried within them the quiet strength of a nation that refused to bow. The story of the 240mm howitzers is not just about a gun. It is about resilience, sacrifice, and the unshakable belief that even the strongest walls of tyranny can be brought down. It is about the young men who stood behind those cannons and the lessons they carried home. That peace is precious, that freedom is fragile, and that the true measure of victory is not in the ruins of fortresses, but in the lives rebuilt after the guns fall silent.